I'm Kathy Wendling, President of the Friends of the North Pikes Creek Wetlands Organization. And the Friends, along with the Audubon Society, are sponsoring the Sumner Matteson Swan presentation this evening. If you want to learn more about the Friends of the North Pikes Creek, please visit us online at northpikescreek.org. And you've all met Erin Burkett now. She's with the UW Extension and the Lake Superior Collaborative, and she's providing us IT support tonight, which we have needed. So I'm glad she's here. First, I want to do a little housekeeping for those of you who aren't familiar with Zoom. If you notice down it's either at the bottom of your screen or the top of your screen, you'll see the chat button down there. Tonight, if you have questions for the speaker, we're going to ask you to submit them over chat. So if you click on chat, you will see that you have a choice of sending your chat to either everyone in the room or the second person on the list is Erin Burkett. So for sending a message to Sumner to answer after the presentation, send it to everyone. Send it to Erin if you're having an IT issue and you want her to address that personally with you in the chat. Our presenter this evening is Sumner Matteson. He's worked with the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources for the past 40 years, both as a non-game biologist, conservation biologist, and avian ecologist. He specializes in the conservation and management of state endangered colonial waterbirds, piping plovers, and trumpeter swans. He wrote the state's recovery plan for the trumpeter swan and directed the state's trumpeter swan recovery efforts for 25 years, working with a diverse array of public and private partners. In 2005, with Kim Grevels, Sumner helped launch the Wisconsin Stopover Initiative, which many of you may be familiar with, which identifies and protects the places where migratory birds stop while traveling between breeding and wintering grounds. Sumner's presentation tonight will be a 30-year retrospective of the Wisconsin Trumpeter Swan Recovery Program. And now I'll turn the meeting over to Sumner Matteson. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Let me just get this. Okay. Thank you for having me. And it is a real honor to be with you this evening. I'm going to begin by acknowledging the Alaskan bush pilot named Rodney King, who passed away in 2018. Rod was one of 5 pilot biologists in Alaska at the time that we collected trumpeter swan eggs, which I'll talk about in a minute. You can see the float plane that we use in the upper left-hand corner. Rod was just a very special individual. He had a great sense of humor. Probably one of the most knowledgeable individuals I've ever met about waterfowl. And he, as I say, he was only one of 5 pilot biologists in Alaska at the time. So he had tremendous expertise. And I have a few stories that I will tell you about later on regarding some of the things that he said to me. Okay, so here's a picture from a 1985 National Geographic magazine showing the historic distribution of trumpeter swans. And as you can see, they occupied the vast territories in Canada and across the northern United States. Their wintering areas at that time are in light green. And for our birds in the Midwest here, they went down the Mississippi Valley to the Gulf Coast. For management purposes, there's basically 3 different populations of trumpeter swans. There's the Pacific Coast population, and those are birds that you see up in the left-hand corner in orange, Alaska. And those birds migrate down the coast, down to British Columbia and the northwestern part of the US. Then there's what's called the Rocky Mountain population. that is a population that involves birds that are in Grand Prairie, Alberta, that migrate down to the Red Rock Lakes area, Wyoming, Idaho, Montana. There was a sedentary population of trumpeter swans, a non-migratory component of that population that was discovered. And at the time of the early 20th century, it was believed that the trumpeter swan was nearly extinct. And one of the reasons was that their feathers were prized by artists such as John James Audubon. You can see pictured here in the upper right. And their skins were ground into powder puffs and used to for basically for women in the East Coast, but also in Europe. And should also say that the feathers were also used in the millinery trade. So the bird was, the population of trumpeter swans was really decimated. And it was believed that in the early part of the 20th century, they were on the verge of extinction when a small population was discovered in the Red Rock Lakes area. And then later, a small population of migratory birds in Alaska. So in 1985, we had a meeting in the department regarding whether or not we should work on bringing back the whooping crane, or should we focus on the trumpeter swan? And Minnesota had already begun trumpeter swan efforts in 1982. So they were 3 years into their effort and were the first ones to go to Alaska to collect eggs to bring back to the Midwest to incubate and to hatch out and to release into the wild. And so at this meeting that we had in 85, a lot of discussion, should we do whooping cranes or trumpeter swans? And it was decided since Minnesota was already started, that we really should join their effort. And so we got in line to go to Alaska to collect eggs. Now, an interesting story about that is that none of us had ever had any experience candling trumpeter swan eggs. And the only places we could go were game farms that had trumpeter swans. So I spent quite a bit of time with different game farms in Wisconsin and also with a few in Minnesota, and became familiar with what to look for in the trumpeter swan egg as far as indication of viability. Now, it's one thing to, when you see it through an electric candler, you can see the embryo. It's a whole different ball of wax when you get out into the field and you have to hold up a trumpeter swan egg. The trumpeter swan eggs, by the way, are about 4 inches in length and 3.5 inches wide. Trumpeter swan is the largest native North American waterfowl, has a wingspan of over 7 feet. The male, or what's called the cob, female is called the pen. The cobs can weigh up to 35 pounds. So a very large, stunning bird. And as I mentioned, candling the eggs in the wild, well, what I was looking for when I went to Alaska was basically 3/4 of the egg as a sort of as a blackened mass when I looked at when I was candling the egg. Of course, that was not often the case. Sometimes you would look through your candler. It was a handheld candler, which I'll show you in a minute, and you'd see an opaque image instead, which was an indication of either a bad egg or an egg that was just newly laid. In any event, this map gives you an indication of the range, historic range. And if you look at those red dots in the map, those are the transplant areas that were used to try to bring back trumpeter swans initially back in the early 80s. So this is a quote from Father Jacques Marquette back in 1673. And if you read through this, this is a description of what he found on the Wisconsin River on the 17th of June. And at the very end of this quote, we saw only deer and cattle, swans without wings, because they dropped their plumage in this country. Well, we knew that they weren't mute swans, because mute swans weren't here until the 50s. And we knew they weren't tundra swans, because at that time of the year, tundra swans are in the Northwest Territories in the Arctic. They had to be trumpeter swans that he was describing. And when I was asked to do the recovery plan, to write the recovery plan in 1986, in my search for historical evidence, I came across some archaeological records that indicated that trumpeter swans were in fact present in Wisconsin. So that we know that based both on the historical accounts of the Jesuit priests and the evidence, archaeological evidence, archival evidence that we had that trumpeters were here. Well, what was our recovery goal? When I wrote the plan, it was a very modest goal of 20 breeding and migratory pairs by the year 2000. And I just want to recognize here the principal individuals that were involved in the research and management. Pat Manthe, Patricia Manthe in the upper left. And here she is at a nest. You can see this is the cob or male defending the nest. This is an indication that the eggs were very close to hatching. And what I discovered when I was in Alaska, a great deal of variation in the behavior of swans. As we would come up to a nest, and I should say that Rod King had gone out prior to our arrival and marked on a topographical map each location of a trumpeter swan nest. And so when we arrived, he simply would pull out his map, and in his small float plane, we would go out to these wetland sites. There were basically two areas where we were collecting eggs: the Minto Flats, west of Fairbanks, and also the Nelchina Basin, about 500 kilometers to the southeast. And so that's Pat Manthe in the upper left. She was the one that was really in charge of a lot of the interns and folks that were involved in monitoring the swans as the population began to build up. Mike Mossman in the center, upper center. Here he is driving off I shouldn't say driving, but gently directing a mute swan off of a nest, because back in before we went to Alaska, which began in 1989, in 1987 and 88, we were involved in attempting to cross-foster trumpeter swans under mute swans. And so we then were simply replacing the mute swan eggs with trumpeter swan eggs. Unfortunately, the 2 years that we tried that was a dismal failure. We ended up using 35 different eggs, and these were from game farms. The reason it failed is that the snapping turtles took care of the cygnets, meaning that they ate them, predated on them. Mute swan population at that time was quite high in the southeastern part of the state. So this is where we focused our cross-fostering efforts. So snapping turtles really did a number on us. We only had, out of 35 eggs, we only ended up from the cygnets that hatched out, only one that reached fledging age. And then the next year, 1989, is when we started going to Alaska. We went to Alaska from 1989 to 1997. In the right-hand corner is Mike's wife, Lisa Hartman, who was also very involved with the research. And I should also mention that Mike was responsible for selecting a lot of the release sites. He would look at the presence or absence of power lines, which is a mortality factor for swans, for trumpeter swans. He would also investigate to see what the hunting history, because it only takes 1 or 2 spent lead pellets to sicken or kill a trumpeter swan. And trumpeter swans, when they are feeding, they will often, in addition to eating aquatic vegetation, both submergence and emergence, they will also search for potamogeton seeds, pondweed seeds. Well, those seeds are about the same shape and size as a spent lead pellet. And they would ingest these and become, in many cases, sick. Some cases they would die. And this was really the real concern at the beginning of the program. Would we be able to overcome lead poisoning? In addition to lead poisoning, we had quite a few instances of some wanton shooting, especially in Illinois, of our birds that would migrate to the south. So vandalistic shooting and lead poisoning were 2 of the bugaboos that we had to deal with. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. Left-hand corner, lower left, is Becky Abel being greeted by a cob or male trumpeter swan when she was coming out to check on a nesting situation. Becky was involved, did her master's work on decoy rearing, which was a major part of our recovery effort. What that involved was when we came back from Alaska with the eggs, all the eggs were transported to the Milwaukee County Zoo. And when the eggs hatched out, and again, these were up to 50 eggs that we were collecting. That very first year, I collected 60, including 10 for Michigan. But those eggs, when they hatched out, and I should say at this point, we had about 93% hatching success. I'll show a slide about that. And in the wild, it's 60 to 80%. So we did quite a bit better than birds typically did in the wild. But this bird, so what Becky did, once the cygnets hatched out, there was a runway at the Milwaukee County Zoo. She set up a pulley system with UW interns, and she was camouflaged so they couldn't see her. And she would pull along a decoy, a life-size decoy. The cygnets then would learn to associate the movement of that decoy with a time to feed and time to rest. And then at 3 to 5 days, the cygnets were flown up to release sites, decoy rearing sites selected by Mike Mossman. And the birds then would be housed in a cage, and then they would be let out of the cage. I have some slides which I'll show you about that. And UW interns throughout the day then would lead these, in a camouflage flow tube, would lead these swans back and forth to feeding sites and resting areas. So Becky did this for her master's work back in the early 90s. And when she received word that one of the birds, one of the decoy reared birds, a pair was nesting, she wanted to investigate, and this is how she was greeted. In the lower center, that's myself to the left, and Ed Diebold, who was the curator of birds at the Milwaukee County Zoo. He was basically responsible for the hatch of trumpeter swan eggs, he and his staff. And to his left is Randy Jurwitz, who was my boss. He's the one that asked me to write the recovery plan, and he's the one that accompanied me to Alaska from 1989 through 1997. So let's see if I can advance this. Okay. So here we have a slide that shows Mary and Terry Kohler to the left. And they heard from Governor Thompson that we needed transportation to Alaska, to Fairbanks, and also to the Nelchina Basin, to Glen Allen, to collect eggs. She called me up, and I should say that I had met her in 1987 because I was co-leading a trip for the International Crane Foundation to southeastern China, and she was on that trip. And there was one time when we were crossing a mountain river, or stream, I should say. We were walking, we were kind of jumping or trying to walk from stone to stone across this creek. She had two Chinese in front of her and two Chinese behind her, and then I was right behind them. She slipped and fell on her keister, and they immediately went to help to pick her up, and she yells out, "Don't touch me." And at which point I said very quickly, I said, "Mary, can I help you?" She's, "Yes, Sumner, would you please help me out?" So I did. She remembered that. She gave me a call about a year and a half later and said that Governor Thompson said that you need transportation out to Alaska. And I said, "Yes, we certainly could use it this year." And she said, "Well, not just this year. How long is this project going on for?" And I said, "Well, through 1996 or 97. And she said, "We're in for all of the years." So they flew us, we got spoiled. They flew us out to both to Fairbanks and also to Glen Allen. And I had never been in a small jet like this, where you could basically, you could reach out with your hand, your arm to the left and touch the wall, and reach out with your right hand and touch the wall. And then right above you was the ceiling, only about, I would say probably no more than 2 feet right above you. So it was very compact and small inside there. But they were a large part, I think, in the success of the project. So this is a slide that shows kind of a composite slide. If you look at the lower left-hand corner, you'll see a black box, a black suitcase-like box. That is what we use. That was handed off to us by the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources. And that was the box that we initially used, not only to put eggs into once I would return from the nest with a small gray suitcase. And that box would hold up to 9 different eggs. And that was what we used that first year. And we had to time our visits to airports on the way back with the peak of hot water. So we'd have to call ahead to the janitors and find out when that peak period was and time our visits to those airports in order to replace the hot water bottles that we were using in that black suitcase-like box. Well, Terry Kohler said, enough of that. I'm going to have the Vollrath company design an incubator that will have basically sensors in there that will allow either a fan to come on if it's getting too warm or a heater to come on to try to keep the temperature between 93 and 97 degrees. And that's what Randy Jurwitz is pulling out. He's looking at a tray. That's him in the center, bottom center there. So those Vollrath incubators were very critical and important, and also an important part of the success of the hatching of the eggs. So we were under orders to leave at least 2 good eggs in a nest. And trumpeters typically have clutch sizes of 5 to 9 eggs in a nest, which is parenthetically kind of a real advantage over the whooping crane project, which has 2 eggs. And I think it's one reason that we saw the kind of growth that we've seen in the population, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. But that's just a photo of me putting a letter and a number for each clutch of eggs that I would come to. And Rod then would transfer that information onto his topo map and come back later on and check on the production of the 2 remaining eggs per pair. So as I mentioned, the collection sites were the Nalchina Basin, and if you look at the map in the upper left hand, you can see the Minto Flats, and then down southeast of that, really near the coast, was the Nalchina Basin. So hatching success at 89 through 97, we collected a total of 385 eggs. As I mentioned, we had 93% hatching success. And as I also mentioned, that typically in the wild, it was 60 to 80% hatching success. So I think we had a little bit of luck, and we also had some excellent support from both the cullers and then, of course, the Milwaukee County Zoo. In that very first year, the late Joe Johnson from Michigan accompanied us out to Alaska. And he didn't actually do any of the collection himself. He was with Randy Jurwitz at the cabin, monitoring the eggs that we would bring back. But I should mention at this point that the egg collection that first year took 13 hours. And it involved probably the most difficult and challenging episode that I've ever been through in my life, because I didn't know it at that time, but I had an inner ear problem. So that I lost my breakfast in the first half hour. And so you can imagine after 13 hours how exhausted I was. And at one point, Rod King turns to me and he says, "You're not going to expire on me, are you?" And all I could do was sort of nod my head groggily. And at that point, by hour number 9, I was so dehydrated, I was losing, my temperature was dropping. I was feeling cold, even though it was 75 degrees out. I ended up wearing a beanie. So I had to endure some great physical hardship that first day. I learned, my doctor, for the following years, prescribed what were called scopolamine patches that really basically neutralized my situation and allowed me to collect without the kind of difficulty I had in '89. So this is a shot of the decoy rearing program. I mentioned the corridor once the cygnets hatched out, so you can see the pulley system in the upper left. Right below that is the University of Wisconsin student in a float tube. You can see he's pulling the top of that netting over him as he goes out, and you can see the lower left-hand corner. He's waiting out to get situated so that when the cygnets are released, he'll have that decoy at the end of a pole. And basically, as you can see in the right-hand side, that's what it looked like. Basically, you can see the hand of the individual there. But because the cygnets were imprinted on that decoy, they would follow that decoy wherever it would go. And so it was the responsibility of the UW interns to lead them out to feeding and loafing areas. Now, the decoy rearing program was the brainchild of Dr. Stanley Temple and Mike Mossman. when we realized that cross fostering by mute swans was not going to work, we looked at other possibilities, and the decoy rearing effort was something that we thought we would try. It was all an experiment, but it proved to be very, very successful. The other major component of the program was called captive rearing. And this was led by Maureen Gross, who you see in the upper or the lower left-hand corner. And here we took the cygnets at about 5 weeks of age and moved them out from Milwaukee County Zoo out to the General Electric Medical Systems facility near Pewaukee. We would wing clip the cygnets when they reached flight stage so they couldn't fly away. We wouldn't pinion them, which means we wouldn't permanently render them flightless, but we would clip the flight feathers. And so we would allow them to be in this environment on a pond for 2 years, at which point we would release them at selected sites that Mike Mossman had selected for us. And so these two programs were really the major component of the recovery effort. We also did something called captive parent rearing, and this is a shot of the swan family at the BP Amico plant in Naperville. And we had 2 other sites that we used, but the idea here was to allow a pair of trumpeters to, in this case, these birds were pinioned, so they weren't able to fly. We allowed them to breed, and then when the cygnets were about 1 year of age, we would remove them. And that's about the time of year anyway when the parents would kick off the cygnets. Cygnets would be on their own basically in the wild. So we would remove them and then release them at selected sites in northern, central, and northwestern Wisconsin. So here's some of the criteria for selecting these release sites. Minimal or no waterfowl hunting. As I mentioned, it only takes 1 or 2 spent pellets to sicken or kill a swan. Abundant, diverse, submerged aquatic plants, submergence and emergence. Minimal uncontrolled human use. That was important from a standpoint of disturbance. The presence of emergent or shrubby escape cover. So we always had stands of emergence that would be part of the release wetland. Absence of power lines. Power lines are always a problem for us. Fortunately, we always lose a few trumpeter swans to power lines. And I've worked with some power companies to put up diverters to try to minimize that. And that was a real problem for us in central Wisconsin. So these would be abundant, diverse wetlands within 10 miles. Actually, there would be abundant, diverse wetlands within 10 miles of the release site, so that when birds would come back, if they didn't pick the release area, there would be other wetlands nearby. And then in addition, the decoy rearing required sites with controlled access and proximity to DNR or Fish and Wildlife Service maintenance facilities. Water depth at these sites were typically 1 to 3 feet, so that our float tubes, our folks in float tubes could operate easily. And then, of course, the presence of a dike for the overnight cages. So between '89 and 2005, total of 394 trumpeters were released. About 50% decoy rearing, another 40% captive rearing, 8% captive parent rearing. So we're looking at about 98% that these techniques were used to release our birds. after the birds were released and allowed to migrate, and once they started to come back and started to nest, we would basically begin our monitoring phase, which began with a spring aerial survey to locate nests, a ground truthing to determine the clutch size when we would find these nests. And then we'd come back to do one more flight in August to locate families and count cygnets. And this was very important. This August flight was very important because we conducted roundups of the cygnets, mostly cygnets, so that we would be able to put alphanumeric collars on them, which will allow us to track their movements during migration. We depended on the public for reports of those birds. And that turned out to be the involvement of the public was very important in helping us to find out where these birds were going. There would be one more flight in September, early October to determine production. So how many of these nesting pairs, how many cygnets were actually produced. As I think I mentioned, the cygnets reach flight stage when they're about 15 weeks of age. So during these roundups, this was the most efficient way to round them up. Kayaks were extremely important. The kayakers working in tandem here would chase down the cygnet. We never lost a cygnet to capture myopathy. So we were quite happy about that, but this involved basically catching up to the swan, the cygnet, putting out the person would put out their hand around the lower part of the neck, and once the human would touch the swan, unlike a Canada goose, swan becomes very docile. So it just completely becomes docile, and it's very easy then to pull in and place in the kayak as the kayaker then moves with that swan between his or her legs and takes it to shore where it's processed. So processing would involve weighing birds, taking blood samples to determine sex, and also see what the lead levels were, if there were any lead issues. And then the birds were released out onto the flowage. And we would involve a lot of YCC folks, International Crane interns. This is a photo of the final group roundup from 2012. So how have we done? Well, as I mentioned, our goal was to have 20 breeding and migratory pairs by the year 2000. Well, when we got around 1997, 98, we were stuck at between 18 and 17. We went from 18 to 17, back up to 18. We weren't sure if we would when we'd be hitting 20. Well, in 2000, it jumped up to 44 pairs. And since 2000, the population has increased almost exponentially. It's been quite dramatic to see the increase that's taken place. So we've been, and I should say that one of the main reasons for that is that when swans are successful in raising a family, as I mentioned, they can have up to 9 cygnets. Usually we wouldn't see that many. Usually at the most we would see would maybe be 8, but typically among those older birds, you get between 5 and 8 cygnets. First-time breeders would have a smaller clutch size, maybe 2 or 3 eggs or 4. But typically those 3 or 4 would usually hatch out. And so once these birds are successful in raising a family, they start a tradition. Well, they will go to the same wintering area and return back to the same nesting area, and sometimes to the very same nest, and simply build up that nest. So a nest can be 5 feet across. And let's see, I'm not sure what happened there. Okay, I just got something on my screen, sorry. So these nests would be built up and they would really become quite large. It was really quite something to see. So this is a map showing the distribution in 2014. 2014 was the last year that we did a survey to locate every single nesting pair on the ground. After 2014, we shifted techniques to aerial surveys. I'll talk about that in just a minute, but this shows the distribution in 2014 of 253 swan nests. You can see that most of these birds were nesting in basically they were nesting in 3 different areas: the northwestern part of the state, the northern part, northeastern part of the state, the central part of the state, the central stands area, and then we had a smaller group of birds in the southwest, and then more recently, birds have been nesting in the southeast. This is just a map that shows that same year, shows the concentration of where these birds were. So what did we learn about breeding habitat characteristics? They were shallow waterfowl production areas, cranberry impoundments, flowages with sedge and cattail marshes, generally 1 to 2 meters deep or less. Sometimes marshes and wildlife area flowages, small ponds, glacial potholes, also backwater sloughs, beaver ponds, bogs, hardwood swamps with marshy islands and islets, lake bay marshes and lake edge marshes. And nests were often constructed on these small islands or islets or built up mounds of detritus. And quite often that we would find them on top of beaver lodges. So as far as migration and wintering, we entered into a project with the Riverbank Zoo in South Carolina, in the Bronx Zoo, Milwaukee County Zoo, and some other conservation groups to equip 16 birds with satellite transmitters. And we found that basically the shortest migration was 41 miles. Birds in the Crux Meadows area up in Burnett County would migrate 41 miles to the Hudson area down to the southwest. Also right along the border with Minnesota there, Monticello. The longest migration during this period, this 3-year period, was 607 miles down to southwestern Illinois. We found that wintering habitats were generally very similar to breeding habitats. You know, in central Wisconsin, there were diked pools and impoundments. And then in wintering areas, they would be reclaimed strip mines managed for waterfowl in southwestern Illinois. We have recently entered into a regional migration ecology study, which is evaluating year-round swan movements, attempting to determine year-round habitat use, identify limiting factors for birds, and calculate, where possible, annual survival rates. And this involves Iowa, Manitoba, Minnesota, Michigan, Ohio, and Wisconsin. 103 birds so far. The results, you can go on, actually, the website, which you can see here, trumpeterswan.netlifty.app/. That will show you the current locations of the trumpeter swans that we have equipped with satellite transmitters. And of course, the technology has advanced to the point where, 20 years ago, we couldn't do that, but now we can do that. We can generate maps. And this is a project, I should say, that's being coordinated and led by David Wolfson out of the University of Minnesota. So we're one of the partners in this. And last year we had 4 cygnets and 1 adult that we captured. And 3 of those cygnets were up near Montello, central Wisconsin. The 1 adult and the other cygnet was up in the Crex Meadows area. We plan on trying to outfit another 7 birds. Probably those will be all adults. One of those will be down here in southern Wisconsin at the Leopold Wetland Reserve, where they've had a pair nesting for several years now. And there's a desire from George Archibald to find out where those birds are going. So that's another exciting aspect of the study, and it's going to help, I think, inform managers about potential survival issues, also potential conflicts, agricultural conflicts if swans are getting into ag fields during migration. So we'll be able to learn quite a bit about the migration ecology of trumpeter swans. As I mentioned, I mentioned that 2014 was the last year of the annual surveys where we got out on the ground. Starting in 2015, in conjunction with the North American Trumpeter Swan Survey, we began to do aerial surveys. And basically we were piggybacking on the Bureau of Wildlife Management waterfowl survey that they do every spring. And Rod Gaddy, who's now retired research scientist with the department, added on an additional 30 transects to the 66 that were already established. So we ended up with 96 randomly selected transects. And basically these are each 30 miles long by a quarter mile wide. And this then, through a careful calculation, we would arrive at what's called the BPOP, or the breeding population estimate. This is Taylor Finger from the Bureau of Wildlife Management, waterfowl biologist, who's in charge of a lot of the waterfowl management programs, and he was flying in this particular year, 2015. This is what they see. This is a picture of what they see. To the left is basically a map that shows the transects east to west across the state, north and south. But this is what they see. And as they get closer, about 500 feet above the swans, you can see how easily they stand out. And if you look carefully here, you can see the clutch of eggs. You can even count them. Right there in the lower part of the center of the slide. Well, what have we learned as far as the population in Wisconsin? So the breeding population was estimated at about 4,600 back in 2015. In 2019, the population reached about 6,000. We weren't able to do any flying last year because of COVID, but based on reports that I've been getting, and people get in touch with me weekly regarding sightings of our collared swans. As I mentioned, 2012 was the last year that we did the roundups, and those swans are turning out to be quite long-lived. I have a slide here, I'll show you in a minute, of one of them. So the lessons learned: identify clear, obtainable research and management objectives, identify and implement a funding strategy early on, and take advantage of opportunities as they arise. And for example, I put on my Sunday best and went down to watch the performance of Swan Lake that was being put on by the Milwaukee Ballet Company and another company. And we were able to do a little fundraising pitch at intermission. So it's just an example of taking advantage of every opportunity we could to raise funds. Remaining open to new and different approaches. Decoy rearing was very important. Releasing trumpeter swans on the Bad River Indian Reservation. I have a quick story about that. When I asked permission to release swans on the Bad River Indian Reservation, and that's one of the largest intact wetlands in the Midwest that they have up on northwestern Wisconsin, east of Ashland in the Odana area. When I was asked to go up there, I was given some advice by Patty Lowe. I don't know if you know who Patty Lowe is, but she was a reporter for WKOW Channel 27 here in Madison. Then became a teacher at the university. She's a member of the Bad River Band. And she said, listen, Sumner, before you talk to the elders, you have to present some tobacco. Well, I'm not a smoker, so I wasn't sure what kind of tobacco to present. I went into a drugstore. I saw all of these different packs of cigarettes, and I thought, wow, okay, this one over here looks really nice. It was a beautiful picture of a buck with a nice rack. And the brand of the tobacco was Bucks, B-U-C-S. Took that up to the meeting. And just before the meeting started, there were 7 tribal elders sitting around a table. I said, before we begin, I'd like to offer some tobacco. And clumsily tried to open the cigarette carton, and some tobacco spilled onto the floor. I was a little embarrassed by that. Then I put down the package so they could see how beautiful it was. Well, the chairman turned to his colleague to his left, and he said, Bucks, isn't that what the white man used to call the red man? And at that point, I turned a very fine shade of scarlet red, extremely embarrassed. And I thought, my God, I might as well just leave right now. And then the next thing he said was, and they have a wonderful way of pausing and making you really just, reflect on what it is that you've said. So he paused and he looked at me and he said, well, because you're such a fool, we'll work with you. And that turned out to be a very important moment, because I learned in future years, and it's true up until this day, that the department, which doesn't have the best relations with the tribes due to spearfishing and other issues, other of my colleagues would try to get permission to get on the reservation, and they were all denied. But for some reason, and I think I know why, they accepted me whenever I would want to get on the reservation to do other work, for example, doing black tern surveys. They made it a point to not only accommodate me, but they would send out one of their wardens with me to help me. So because of that one moment where I was a complete fool, I earned their trust. And that's just an example of a partnership that where you need to really adapt, take advantage of what are the opportunity that's presented. Another important thing is to celebrate the successes with the partners and learn from our failures and disappointments. And above all, I tell this to the whooping crane folks, despite problems they've been having with predation and other issues, to persist and always visualize reaching the goal, which I think is a good life lesson as well. So this is just a list of some of the program partners. We've had over 700 different partners. These are some of the major program partners, different bureaus within the department: Science Services, Wildlife Management, Minnesota DNR, very important, Michigan DNR, Fish and Wildlife Service, Trumpeter Swan Society, the Natural Resources Foundation of Wisconsin, which was very important in raising funds, Milwaukee County Zoo, of course, and the Zoological Society of Milwaukee County, University of Wisconsin, Department of Wildlife Ecology, General Electric Medical Systems, where we had the captive rearing program, Terry Kohler's Windway Capital Corporation, International Crane Foundation with all of their interns that helped out with the roundups, and the Bad River Band of the Lake Superior Chippewa. So here's a bird. This bird has a very unique history. This is 82K. In 2015, 26 years old. The oldest known, at that time, the oldest known marked swan in North America, according to the Breeding Bird Laboratory. Now, the history behind this bird is that this was an egg, U2, that I collected at hour number 12 when I was absolutely exhausted. And I came up to this nest. Rod King couldn't get very close to this one. So he would make sure that I would wear a vest that had a ripcord on it. So if I should fall through the bog that I was walking over, to pull that cord, so at least they'd be able to find my body. So I stumbled over to this nest, and what should greet me but this cob that was intent on attacking me. Well, I had my paddle along and I kind of fended him off. He ends up flying up into the air. He then attacks the rear of the plane. He clips the communication antenna so that we weren't able to communicate with the airport about our ETA, our estimated time of arrival. And Rod King then had to go to a remote cabin and dig up a ham radio to call his wife to have her call the airport about our ETA. So this one of the eggs was U2, 82. It turned out to be 82K. We don't think it lived longer than another year after this because it has not been seen again. But that's the story behind this particular bird. And then finally, I just want to show this shot that was taken this winter of a pair of unmarked trumpeter swans that were wintering on Lake Mendota. And in this case, this shot was taken on Lake Monona as the ice was still present, but it's really a beautiful shot. And I think it kind of captures a lot of the sentiments that we feel about the program. So thank you very much. I appreciate your patience and listening. If you have any questions, maybe you can, maybe the questions could just be read out to me. Aaron or somebody? Kathy or Aaron, if you want to just read whatever questions are there, I'd be happy to try to answer them.
Yeah, I think Kathy was planning to read the questions. Unless you'd like me to do that, Kathy. I don't hear her. We did get a few, so I'll just start and then Kathy can jump in.
Sure.
One was let's see, from Anne. They said, we see and hear trumpeter swans almost daily and have noticed that they often sound like they are calling in two tones. We wonder if they can produce two tones at once, or do two trumpeter swans call in such synchrony that their calls make harmony and are timed together?
That's really an excellent question. Whoever asked that question must be a musician. That's a great question. So often I think it's more the latter. Although sometimes when you hear them vocalize, they will vocalize. You'll see them opposite like this, and they will vocalize often when they're across from each other. They will flap their wings, and it's a way of strengthening their pair bond. And that vocalization is a little bit different. So that's a more rapid, sonorous call that they do, rapid call to each other. But often what you'll hear overhead is this trumpet-like, hence the name Trumpeter Swan, a trumpet-like bugling as they are approaching their territory, or as they're approaching a staging area. So there can be two different sets of vocalizations.
Okay.
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Okay, sorry, something happened with my headset. It's just-
Oh, okay, okay. Do you want to take over the questions?
Sure,
Okay.
sure. There's several questions here tonight, Sumner. The second one is, you mentioned game farms, and someone asked, how prevalent are game farms and have trumpeter swans that have trumpeter swans, and what do they do with them?
Yeah, so I was most familiar with game farms 20 years ago, and I have to admit I have not had any interactions with them since then. But I can tell you at the time, they were involved with the Trumpeter Swan Society in raising trumpeter swans that could then be released. Not everyone, but some of them were. Certainly some of the ones that were in Wisconsin were doing this. So they were involved in a way, kind of a quiet way at the beginning of the Trumpeter Swan program. They're no longer, they are no longer needed for that effort. But I should also say that some of them would raise cygnets that then would be used by companies to the south as those birds would become older. They would be basically pinions. They couldn't fly away, but they would be used they would still go through their breeding behavior and drive away Canada geese. And that was the main issue. These companies wanted Canada geese off of their property because they had all kinds of issues with defecation on the lawn and employees coming out during lunch break and encountering all of these geese all over the place that were leaving their droppings. So they were involved, some of them were involved with these companies to basically to keep geese off of those ponds. But that was back then. Now I just don't know enough about what they're doing. I know that that some may have trumpeter swans, but I have not heard anything about them in recent years.
Okay, I'm going to skip a question and go to this one. Do you know of other species that would benefit from our intervention to reestablish at least a portion of their former range?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I have often used trumpeters as kind of the ambassadors for wetland preservation. So, for example, one of our endangered terns, black terns, will nest in the same kind of habitat, the hemi-marsh. So you have our secretive marsh birds also present, rails and bitterns, that occupy the same habitats. So by preserving and restoring trumpeters, we have also paid attention to restoring habitats important to these other secretive marsh birds and other wetland birds that occupy that same community.
Thank you. Another question for the aerial surveys. Why were the confidence intervals so wide?
Yeah, that's just a byproduct of the formula. And I think each of these surveys that have occurred with the aerial surveys have had high confidence intervals, which really is a reflection that the number is not precise. But instead of using, one way you could look at it is use the range, but typically what states have done throughout the Midwest, for example, Minnesota, and I should say that, well, I've got two thoughts at once. Minnesota has a population now of 17,000 trumpeter swans. The interior population, the estimate for the interior population is in 2015 was 27,000. And the Rocky Mountain population was back in 2015 was about 12,000, 11,770, I believe it was. And the Pacific Coast population in 2015 had a population of 24,000. So for a grand total of about 63,000.
Are mute swans still a threat to the trumpeter population today?
It's a very good question. I would say no, because the numbers now are because we have in Wisconsin, we have thousands now of trumpeters. The mute swan population has been controlled with wildlife services, part of USDA, doing a lot of the control efforts, controlling mute swan numbers. So the numbers of mute swans are compared to the numbers of trumpeters are quite a bit lower. And where we see the greatest number of mute swans is really in southeastern Wisconsin. And that's where we see the fewest number of trumpeters. Now there may be a relationship there because, you know, mute swans, older mute swans can outcompete a younger trumpeter swan pair. And we find at some of these wetlands in southeastern Wisconsin quite a high density of mute swans. But overall, the population is just, I don't want to say a pittance, but very, very, very small compared to what we now have for trumpeters in the state. So they are no longer a threat. They may be in some localized situations, they may be outcompeted, but generally speaking, looking at the state as a whole, they're not a threat.
Thank you. Several slides ago, you discussed sources of released swans, and it looks like there was one swan from a miscellaneous source. What was that? What was the miscellaneous source?
Yeah, miscellaneous is that in this case it was Minnesota DNR, where they had some birds that they then contributed to our program. And that's basically the miscellaneous birds there.
Okay. And here's from someone who says, what's the likelihood that the two pairs that stay on my lake for a few days each spring are the same birds each year? They're on a small lake near Brule. Where are they headed when they leave our lake?
Yeah, what you'll see in March, late February, depending on the weather, but throughout March is that you'll have a number of birds that will go to staging areas that they are familiar with en route to their breeding territories. So unless there is a large wetland with basically a hemi-marsh situation with abundant emergence and submergence, more than likely they are going to be going on to where that breeding area is. And breeding areas are very easily identifiable by a landowner or someone that has property along a lake. Because if they see trumpeter swans nesting, they cannot be mistaken for anything else. They really stand out. I get a number of reports every year and photos of trumpeters on a person's, quote unquote, on a person's lake or pond, and they take a lot of pride in their swans. So during March, that's when you see a lot of the staging taking place. And generally trumpeter swans, and also I should say into April, really up through, I would say probably mid-April or so. It's at the end of April and the beginning of May that eggs are laid. And I should just say briefly that the same nest, if the same nest isn't used, that the male will uproot vegetation and basically use the bill, transfer that to the cob at the edge of where the nest structure is, and she will take that vegetation and add that to the nest or help complete a nest, and then she will shape the bowl with her breast and belly. So they have a very distinct distinctive role. She does the incubation. Incubation lasts about 33 to 34 days. Young fledged at about 15 weeks of age. And it's usually the cob that defends the nest against any intruders. Should also say that after the young hatch out, when they are about 2 to 3 weeks of age, the adults go into molt. So it's usually the pen or female that molts first, loses all of her flight feathers, sheds those flight feathers. It takes about a month to grow those back. She disappears into the emergent vegetation, basically hides out. The male then takes over responsibility of really defending the nest and the cygnets. And then when she regrows her flight feathers, it's his turn. So they have a very synchronous period there where the female will go into, the pen will go into her molt, followed by male.
Thank you. Another question here. Do tundra swans occur in Wisconsin?
Yes, they do. They occur they don't nest here, but they occur here during migration, and really fall migration is a great time to see them. In December, during the Christmas bird counts, they are usually they number in the hundreds, and you can tell a tundra swan from a trumpeter by, well, one way is by the shape of the bill, but often in flight you don't see it that clearly. You don't see the size. They are quite a bit smaller than trumpeters, but in the air they don't look. You can't tell. You don't have that perspective. So the best way to tell them apart is through their vocalizations. And a pack of tundras, I just heard them about. I remember hearing them over the winter back in December at night, and they sound like a pack of baying hounds, kind of yipping and hollering. They sound like a pack of baying hounds, and so it's very distinctive apart from the sonorous bugle of the trumpeter. The other characteristic feature is that about 80% of tundra swans have a yellow spot in front of the eye, whereas trumpeters have this distinctive salmon-colored stripe on the lower mandible. So if they're not vocalizing, often you can tell them apart that way. But yes, so the fall is a great time to see them congregating both in southwestern and central and south central, southeastern, and also on Lake Michigan as well. And I should also say up in Chequamegon Bay, up on Lake Superior, as they migrate through.
Thank you. Thank you. We have a few more questions. See if people stick around to hear the answers. Are trumpeters still endangered in Wisconsin? And are there any laws restricting the approach distance?
Yeah, they were removed from our endangered and threatened list back in 2009, and they are still protected as a migratory bird by the Fish and Wildlife Service. So although they don't have that endangered status anymore, they still are a protected bird.
Okay, is there any regulation or recommendation for an approach distance if you're saying a canoe?
Yeah, that's a good question. One thing that I can mention about trumpeter swans is that there's a great deal of variation in their behavior, so that if you should happen to be canoeing and you're unwaringly or unwittingly near a nest, you can have a pair be very aggressive. In other words, they could charge you. Others would simply be keep their distance, be as far away from you as possible. So there is this wide variation in behavior. As far as a safe distance, I would say if you're out canoeing in a marsh, you'll often hear them vocalizing. So you'll know where they are. trumpeters during the breeding season are very vocal. So more than likely you would hear them. And if that's the case, it's best to keep a distance of 100 meters or more from a bird.
Thank you. That's good advice. Here's one more question. When swans stage, do pairs always travel together, or do they sometimes wait on the other to catch up? We usually have a pair stage here near Palmer, Alaska, but we've only seen one so far this year. So do they split up sometimes?
It's another good question. They typically will stage together. If you're just seeing one adult, it could be an unfortunate situation where that other adult is no longer alive. Because typically a pair, if it's a pair, they will stage together. There are, however, examples of unmated birds that show up with, and usually this is something that you'll see with subadult birds. You'll see a small flock of 3 or 4 or 5 trumpeter swans together. These are often non-breeders, subadult birds. And what I mean by subadult is that up until really these restoration programs, it was thought that trumpeters don't breed until they're 4 or 5 years of age. Well, that was largely because the information was from studies of saturated habitat. And so you had older birds occupying these areas, and you would find that you often would find that because you have these saturated habitats, you had high density of birds. Well, when we reintroduced these birds to Wisconsin, we had this broad area, swath, if you will, of wetlands that were underutilized. And what we found is that trumpeter swans can breed as early as 2 years of age if they have the right habitat and if they are allowed to breed. So we find that our birds can nest as early as 2. So when I say subadult, I'm talking really about the 1-year-old birds.
Okay, well, I believe that's the end of our questions. A lot of people have gone into the chat to thank you, Sumner, for the great presentation. And we also want to let you know, everybody, that today's webinar recording has been posted on the Lake Superior Collaborative's YouTube page, and it will be up tomorrow. It's a long address, so I will also put it on our page. If you're interested, look down at the bottom of chat, and you can select that address now. We'll also put a link to it on the northpikescreek.org website so that you'll have a chance to look at it later. And that's all our questions for tonight. And we thank you, Sumner, for the great presentation. It's been really interesting. It's so interesting to find out how you brought those eggs down here.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been a real pleasure and honor for me. I really appreciate it.
Well, we certainly appreciate your time and your efforts.
All right, you bet.
Thank you all.
Have a good weekend.
You too.